she, her, and hers. I'm going to be a third-year landscape architecture major, and welcome to the Unlearning series. So this week's topic is on the G word defined. But before we get into that, I thought I'd just give a little introduction on what the Unlearning series is. I'm sure some of us have been here at the past few sessions, but in case you're new, so why Unlearning? The Unlearning series is a series of discussions throughout the summer that aim to question our practices and education in the built environment. It is an alternate method of education where we recognize that our disciplines have shaped and supported systems of oppression, and that each of us have the tools to be critical of this through discussion, processing, and activism. Our goal with this series is that we recognize how our disciplines have historically contributed to how systemic racism and injustice, and that we learn what principles we can use in our work as planners, builders, and designers to ensure the creation of inclusive spaces and communities. So to those of us that couldn't make it last week, I thought I'd give a little recap on last week's session, which was on placemaking as a transformative act. So last week we learned, if you missed last week's presentation, there is a link to the recording at bit.ly/CAED-unlearning. And basically last week we learned about placemaking, and we learned that placemaking is about prioritizing the people's best interests in the environment. It is prioritizing inclusivity of the online community, of the entire community, to create transformative places. It's typically used when talking about urban developments, but placemaking is also relevant in other areas, such as college campuses, workspaces, and other public spaces. Essentially, acknowledging place matters to people and communities. So what is the G word? The G word, otherwise known as gentrification, is the process by which people with higher incomes and higher statuses invest in and relocate to lower income urban neighborhoods. Oftentimes, these neighborhoods are historically underserved by both the public and the private sector. So people looking to settle in these communities often capitalize on the low property values and inflate them. In doing so, they displace the people currently living there, and they fundamentally change both the culture and the character of that neighborhood. Gentrification is especially common in large urban cities such as New York City and Los Angeles. One thing I want to bring up is that gentrification is not just a class issue here in the United States. This quote from Stacey Sutton's TED Talk defines gentrification as both a race issue and a class issue because of the centuries of systemic racism perpetuated in this country. It is important to note that many of the neighborhoods that are being gentrified are disproportionately occupied by Black and Brown people, and that the people living in these neighborhoods are usually displaced by white people. The interchangeability of gentrification as both a class and a race issue is deeply rooted in forms of discrimination used throughout history to keep Black and Brown folks out of these communities. A well-known example of this discrimination is redlining, a term coined by the Federal Housing Administration used in their system of maps that rated neighborhoods based on their perceived stability. Neighborhoods where Black people lived were ranked poorly and subsequently marked in red, making those neighborhoods ineligible for obtaining loans and therefore making them undesirable to live in. One of the most adverse effects of gentrification is the displacement of people in the communities being gentrified. There are two types of displacement caused by gentrification. The first is direct displacement, which is what most of us think of when we hear about it. Direct displacement is when rent in the neighborhood increases so much that the residents can no longer afford to pay, and they are left with no choice but to leave the neighborhood. The other option is indirect displacement, which is also known as exclusionary displacement. This type of displacement is faced by people in rent-controlled housing in gentrified communities. While these residents are fortunate enough to remain in place, they feel a sense of increased isolation due to the displacement of most of their social network, as well as the influx of amenities constructed that are too expensive and too unaffordable for them to use. These people then choose to leave because the community that they once knew and loved suddenly feels unfamiliar to them. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this image. The High Line in New York City is an exemplary project we have learned about in our curriculum, and it is consistently praised for its innovation in reimagining old infrastructure into green public space. The reason why I bring up the High Line is because it is an example of how the green space and added amenities can result in the gentrification of a neighborhood. Prior to its opening in 2006, the area was home to an elevated railway that was closed for years, and the neighborhood that it was located in, Chelsea, was seen as gritty and in generally poor condition during the late 20th century. This space was then reimagined into the park that we know today as part of a project to revitalize the neighborhood, and it essentially became a huge tourist attraction due to its popularity. Since its inception, the High Line raised property value in what was previously considered an affordable area of Manhattan. In fact, Robert Hammond, the executive director of the nonprofit that helps maintain the park, actually acknowledged this in a recent interview and said that he had failed the community, citing that the High Line did not achieve its initial purpose in serving the surrounding neighborhood and instead demographically divided it. The High Line is an example of environmental gentrification, which is when green space is constructed to make the neighborhood more desirable, thus driving up the property value of that neighborhood and displacing its residents. So that brings us to the question of, how can we reduce environmental inequity without displacing the people that these improvements are supposed to benefit? One method is the just green enough model, which was coined by urban geographer Winifred Curran. It seeks to fix injustices without introducing the fancy amenities that transform neighborhoods. Curran used the case study of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, a historically Polish neighborhood located on the waterfront close to an industrial area. Residents and nonprofit organizations engaged in community activism to create a greener neighborhood while maintaining the industrial character of that neighborhood. They sought to avoid the parks, cafes, and river walks model, and instead opted to create green space, such as this nature trail along Newtown Creek, which is actually located next to a sewage treatment plant. This project also sought to expand the neighborhood's access to water and preserve working class jobs in order to serve its residents and avoid gentrification as much as possible. Okay, there was another slide, but I guess it got skipped. But basically, it was a quote from Curran, and it basically reads, "It's about the people, it's not about the place." And when designing for low-income communities, we are often faced with a paradox. These communities often suffer from environmental injustice and shortage of green space. But when we address those concerns by opening parks, the neighborhood becomes more desirable and starts the process of environmental gentrification. This quote by Curran is a good philosophy to keep in mind when trying to prevent this. While there may not be a perfect solution to fighting against gentrification, there are a few things we should keep in mind. When designing, our project should be determined by specific community needs and preferences, and we also need to ensure that access to green space is distributed throughout the neighborhood so that it can be used by all of its residents. Essentially, we are designing projects first and foremost for people, not just the place. Thank you. And now we're going to actually go into group discussion. So one of our D+I members created breakout rooms for us to join in a bit. And these are just some guidelines. So first, challenge yourselves to be uncomfortable and be in this space to ask questions and hold discussion about this topic.